Okay.
Yeah, it says. Yep, it says it's recording.
Okay, perfect. Alrighty, well, everybody, welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And I am super excited, very honored by the guests that we have. We are joined by journalist and historian Thomas Frank, and we're going to be talking about populism, progressivism, where does the left go from here with the incoming 2020 massacre,
Huh.
and all sorts of stuff. So first of all, so Mr. Frank, thank you very much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Youri Smooter.
Thank you, and likewise. I actually have to confess. Of course, I'm a huge fan of all of the guests that that give me their time on One Plus One. Many of them I've been following for 5 years, but you're actually the first guest that I've actually been following in one form or another since I was in high school.
Oh my
Actually.
god. Oh my god. You're gonna make me feel old here.
So yeah, so I mean, I was in high school when I would watch, the Bill Moyers, when I would watch, the Bill Moyers show and programs like that. And every now and then, you were always the one guest I was the most interested in with what's the matter with Kansas,
Yeah.
and when you were covering the oh my
What
gosh,
the you
who was
talking about
that crook?
George W. Bush, the Wrecking Crew?
Yeah, exactly. And who was that Republican crook? I can't remember his name
Was it
now.
Jack Abramoff?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The Jack.
Okay. So that was a really interesting chapter. Yeah.
Exactly. So I'm very familiar. I'm very familiar with your work, and I oh and when you came out with your book, Listen Liberal. I was already and I already saw I had already seen even documentaries based on your book What's the Matter with Kansas, but when you came out with Listen Liberal, I said to myself, okay, I've I've been familiar with Thomas Frank for many years. I need to get Listen Liberal, and I need to get What's the Matter with Kansas. And What's the Matter with Kansas was especially a very fun book to read after after the Corbyn project got completely massacred last year.
After wait, after who did? What? Who?
After Jeremy Corbyn was
Oh, right.
completely, yeah, after he was massacred, and and the Johnson Tories and the fundamentalist Brexiteers of the right achieved uh, achieved victory last year. I said to myself, okay, now I really need to read What's the Matter with Kansas, because I just do not understand why the working class
Yep.
votes the way it
Yep.
does
I know,
sometimes.
and it's that situation is only going to get worse. I mean, unless well, I'm sure we're going to talk about this, but how long is this going to go on? It's been going on for 50 years now. Well, now you've read the new one, so I go into this question yet again.
Well, actually, I've not gotten your new book yet. However, I you were already speaking with Adam Johnson of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, how you wanted to do a book about populism because everybody's talking about populism. Yeah, and your new book is the
The
People
people,
Know,
yeah,
which was about the first populist movement, the Populist Party from your home state of Kansas.
yep,
That's when you're. I mean, that's when you're saying, "What's the matter with Kansas? This is a great thing about Kansas." Whereas the very far right
yeah,
movement which is taking place in Kansas. So
yes.
anywho, and yeah, and it's and but to answer your question, when is this going to stop, this vicious cycle? I don't think it's ever going to stop. I mean, my favorite one of my my least favorite song from my hero Frank Zappa, but it's a thing I but it's a thing he often said. One of his songs was "The Torture," never stops.
Yeah. Wow. Well, everything
And
has an endpoint, and these, you go through these periods in history, and they start, and they run their course, and they end. And this is cold comfort, because this has been a really destructive little cycle. This has been a very destructive period. So I was born,
yeah,
Youri, and tell me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. It's Youri, right?
it's Youri, but Youri, and then the last name is Smoucher.
Oh man, really? Okay.
Yes, but don't worry, everybody always pronounces it wrong. Even my mother, who's married to my father, she still has to Frenchify it by saying smooter. So
Smooter.
so
Smooter.
so no
So
problem.
look, I was born in 1965. It was the year they passed the Voting Rights Act, and I believe Medicare was that year. But it was the high point of the Great Society. This country was going to expand prosperity to everyone, the ever widening circle of prosperity. The middle class was going to grow and grow, and someday it would incorporate everyone. But it was already pretty it was already pretty substantial.
Yeah.
I was born
And
into a
black
middle.
people were going to be included in it.
Yeah, that's right. That was the idea.
Black people, a little bit of Latinos, maybe Native Americans were going to be included in this great society.
That was the dream. And what happened was, it was for white people in the northern states, and even for some black people in the northern states, it was a social democracy. They had union jobs, they had health care. It wasn't like a European country where it was all guaranteed in law, but it was a de facto social democracy. A place like Detroit or like Kansas City, where I grew up, and that world's been destroyed. We, instead of making it larger and incorporating everybody in it, we wrecked it. And
that's what Reaganomics and voodoo economics was basically all about.
Yeah, and it's yes, and the sort of tearing it apart, and it's with the complicity of the Democrats as well, and that's where I don't see that cycle ending anytime soon. Instead, it's taken on this new perversity where you have Republicans like Donald Trump who will actually pretend to be on the left on certain issues. By the way, this is you're in Belgium. This is unsayable in America. But Trump was two Hillarys left on the trade issue and on the issue of wars.
Exactly. And then not only that.
That really hurt the Democrats, and
then not only that, the Democrats who sort of were the party amongst with a little bit of smart Republicans like Nixon, they were the ones that kind of like say, hey, if we don't want to all die in a nuclear catastrophe, let's have a little bit of détente with the Russians. Yeah. Let's have a little bit of détente with the Chinese, and now you have the Democrats who were the original Cold War party, although we have to be honest, but we do have the Democrats now who have this anti-Russia, except instead of communism, it's Putin's derangement syndrome. And then you have Donald Trump from the Republican Party who's like saying, hey, why don't we actually get along with the Russians? And everyone's like, are you insane? You have just broken heresy.
I know. It's totally weird. Now, on the other hand, Trump doesn't mean it. He doesn't know what he's talking about. When he did go to renegotiate NAFTA, it didn't really make that much of a difference. And he didn't. And on the campaign trail, anybody that paid attention could tell that he had no clue what he was talking about. But I mean, it's just I bring it up because it's become so baroque and strange, this system that we're in with and this cycle that we're in. And I do wonder where the end point is, because it's not, there's no immediate political reason for it to end. Donald Trump they're going to continue down this path. I mean, this guy just 5 years ago, American commentators were saying the Republican Party is dead. They're dying. They're because the demographics of the country are changing, and look, here come, and they the coalition of the ascendant, which I wrote about in Listen Liberal. You can't stop the coalition of the ascendant, and look what this guy does. He goes out and he wins Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Ohio. Oh my God! And the Republicans are not ever turning back from that. They're continuing down that road. And I don't know what the end point is, except for that I do want to repeat it. It has to end at some point. It has to break down. And
I think it's only going. I think it's only going to break down if one or two things happen. If climate change already, happens, in 12 years as opposed to 2050, when apparently we're all going to die from climate change. So if it was to come much earlier, because the oligarchs of the world are really doing their best at like killing the planet for stupid pieces of money, which makes absolutely no sense, because that ends their business. So this vicious cycle is only going to end if climate change either wipes us out, or if the left actually has that revolutionary spirit, that solidarity spirit, and
well, they don't. I don't know about Belgium, but they're here in America. They are the opposite of that. The left in this country, such as it is, the left is meaning the Democratic Party is about expertise, meritocracy, putting the smart guys in charge, and they cannot learn lessons from their own failures. Well, to a large degree, because they deny that those failures took place. They can't, so you look at the Obama administration, and I was, it's funny, Youri, because this is the one time in my life where I was like, okay, I'm going to let down my guard. I'm going to stop being cynical, and I'm really going to believe in a presidential candidate.
That's actually one thing I actually did want to talk to you about, because I did actually want to take issue with the fact that you, like so many people, did think that Obama was going to be some kind of an FDR type of person, or at least some kind of a Kennedy, a Kennedy type of person.
I had reasons for thinking that at the time. He had given a couple of speeches about Wall Street where he seemed to understand the problem in a way that say Hillary Clinton or John McCain or any Republican you care to mention, in a way that they did not. But the larger thing was that I thought history was going to force Obama's hand. I thought that the situation he was in was going to make him act like FDR. I mean, FDR wasn't even FDR when he went into office. Nobody really knew what to expect, and then 4 years later, it was clear where he stood, because he had by that time done incredible things. But no, it never happened with Barack Obama, and that. That's what led me to writing Listen Liberal, to trying to understand this. I mean, look, it was something I should have grasped many years before. I'd been badly disappointed by Bill Clinton as well.
Yeah.
But yes, anyhow, that's what led to that particular moment, trying to understand Obama's failings. And but the thing is that American liberals, by and large, are not interested in having that moment of grappling with their own movement and their own record. They're not interested in that. And instead, I mean, geez, when he was, and I know you don't want to talk about this. Just interrupt me whenever you want. Okay.
Because that was actually the second to last question I was going to ask you, but yeah. So let's switch it around. So before we actually talk about the why the reactionary right movements keep coming about, and before we actually do talk about the contents of your book, which is about populism and the real difference between populism and progressivism, back in that time, let's actually talk a little bit about the Obama years, because many people who I thought should have known much better did prop up Obama, just like people in Canada propped up Justin Trudeau, when I don't know, I think I had the cynicism, that you said that you suspended when Obama was rising, because I kept listening to speeches of Obama and I kept listening to interviews of Obama, and I thought to myself, this is the most boring centrist bag I have ever had
Oh, that's funny.
the displeasure of listening to. Same thing with Justin Trudeau in Canada,
I
which
think,
was
well, I
what
thought Obama was
when I was in
inspiring.
high school, I was a huge fan of Dennis Kucinich, Mike Gravel, and Ron Paul before I started to understand the implications of libertarianism and the market fundamentalism that's associated with Ron Paul's economic issues. But I liked Ron Paul for his anti-imperialism and him
He
wanting
was
to
good
end
on
the
that. He
prohibition
was good
drug
on that.
war.
Do you want to hear a funny story? So,
Go
by the
right
way,
ahead.
I always liked Kucinich too. Kucinich was a great guy, and I think that he's been, he was he was really unfairly treated. But I used to go to a lot of Republican gatherings in order to write about them, journalism, right?
Yeah.
And I was at one, I don't remember where it was. It was in the Tea Party movement days. And I was at one, and Republican gatherings always have two tiers of seats: the people who paid extra money, and they get to sit in like the celebrity area or whatever you call the VIP area, and then the
The,
ordinary,
the very important, despicable
yeah,
deplorables.
they always do. They always do this. They always do this. And I was sitting in that area because that's where they decided to put journalists. And you had all these the donors were there. The sort of donor. They were wearing nice clothes, and then the kids who were just attending, the event, were sitting over at this other section. And here comes Ron Paul to give his speech. And his speech is divided into two parts. Okay, one about the foreign policy stuff, and the other about his like nutty love of the gold standard, or whatever it is, right? But the foreign policy stuff, the kids are like, yeah, and the donors are just like, shut up, they're so grumpy. They really disliked it. And then he switches and he's talking about the gold standard or whatever. And then the rich donors are like, yeah, this guy's great. And the kids are like, who cares?
That is crazy. That is crazy. But Mr. Frank, but that reminds me so much of when Donald Trump, for whatever reason, like the one part of his brain that actually has like a little bit of like goodness in it started to come out, and he demolished Jeb Bush and the Bush administration's foreign policy legacy when he went on this huge rant about how the Iraq War was a bunch of lies. They knew they were lying, and then when Jeb Bush was like saying, well, you know what? My brother made us safe, and I'm tired of you attacking him. And then Trump went, the World Trade Center came down during your brother's reign.
I know. No, that was good. And what did he call him? Low energy Jim.
Low energy Bush. But the entire the entire audience is booing Donald for for sounding like Michael Moore on on how Bush handled 9/11. Marco Rubio's like, I'm glad Al Gore was I'm glad Al Gore wasn't president. And Donald's like, how could he have kept us safe when the World Trade Center came down and listen to the advice of his CIA? And it's the one time that Donald Trump got a unanimous boo in the audience.
And now the Republican Party has actually come around to his we're living through crazy things are happening here in America where that wing of the Republican Party is now fully with Joe Biden. They're riding with Biden, and Biden, oddly enough, now I am not privy to Biden's thinking, and I don't really understand the strategy, except for that he thinks that he's got it in the bag, which he probably does. But it still concerns me because that was what the Hillary people thought as well. But he thinks that by reaching out to those guys, that's the winning move. That's how you win an election. And it's like those guys have zero following. The neoconservatives, the foreign policy hawks, that is a position in American politics with zero following, and that
Well, in
in
fact,
libertarian economics, those two things are like
in fact, I mean, one last thing I'll say about that before we get into these, these three big questions I wanted to ask you was that, oh wait, what did I want to say? No, I mean, exactly, the neoconservatives are completely discredited because the Ron Pauls of the world and people who actually read, American Conservative, antiwar.com, and listen to, the Scott Horton show, those people, yeah, again, like you said, they love the Republican Party for their, for their market fundamentalism, for their, greed is good ethos and so forth. But for whatever reason, they're anti-imperialists. They don't see the logic behind having.
They're old school isolationists. So this was a an important strain in politics before World War II, and it was badly discredited. But there were people who were on the left as well as on the right who were part of that movement this is in the late 30s and all right up until Pearl Harbor, but it was badly discredited by that, and then it didn't make a comeback until very recently here. Isolationism when I was growing up was a bad word. Unfortunately, the opposite of it is that leads you to things like the Vietnam War. So nice going, internationalists.
Syria, Libya, Iraq, the coup that took place in Ukraine, and all of this Russia Putin derangement syndrome. But again, briefly going back to Obama, I was never impressed with Obama. I liked Dennis Kucinich, Mike Gravel, and Ron Paul. The only time I got around to the hopeful thinking of people like you, Bill Moyers, Democracy Now! And so forth, was when Obama actually gave his speech at the DNC when he was officially, inaugurated. And then all of a sudden, he didn't sound like a boring centrist to me. He actually
was awesome.
Did
Come on. He had his moments. And it's funny how fast it all crumbled. And so then you get to and I know I don't know if you want to talk about this or not. I'll talk about whatever you want, but if you don't stop me, I just keep rolling.
I would say, briefly get into how we all thought Obama was going to be a flaming left winger, but then he went to being another.
You've got this terrible problem. I mean, so all of Obama's great victories are half measures, and it's just the halting steps. His re-regulation of Wall Street, which Trump has immediately undone. As everybody was saying at the time, don't do it that way because the next Republican president will take it apart. He did it that way. Or his the stimulus package, which was way too small, or Obamacare, which has turned out to be based on a terrible mistake, which is basing your health insurance on your job status. Here we're in a pandemic. Everybody's losing their job. They're losing their health care in the middle of a pandemic. And because it was Obama that did it, and because it was regarded as such an incredible achievement, the mainstream of the Democratic Party cannot turn their backs on it and just say, look, we got to move on. We got to do the right thing here. 80% of the country wants a better system. Right. You've got to. And they will not do it because they've already put everything on the world-shaking historical brilliance of Obamacare. And this is the trap that Biden is in right now. I mean, it's that he's in. Whatever. He doesn't. I don't think he really understands or even cares really. But that is the trap that the Democratic Party's in. I'll tell you one last thing about that. When Obama's last 2 years as president, he did almost nothing. He really did almost nothing. And people like me were very frustrated. And I was writing a column for Salon.com at the time. And I wrote one of the articles I wrote was like, I called a bunch of people and said, here in DC, and I said, what could Obama do? He doesn't have Congress, but he's still the president. Could he do anything that would be good? they're like, hell yes. He could prosecute Wall Street executives for fraud. All these guys in the financial crisis. He could start enforcing antitrust laws, go after Silicon Valley, which is much in the news right now. He could go after the universities for raising the tuition. It's just out of control, the student debt crisis,
he
etc.
wouldn't do it.
He didn't do any of these things. They all would have made him beloved. They would have made him a hero. And he wouldn't do it. And instead, the sort of commentary class of this country, I call them the pundit bureau, they started writing these articles. Yeah, but they
establishment windbags.
Yeah, but they all do everything as a group. They do everything as everything they do is they do together. And they started writing these articles saying it was unfair to criticize Obama in this way for doing nothing, because that's expecting him to be a superhero and have like secret powers. And then my favorite one was in the New York Times, where a columnist, a serious pundit, said, the presidency is actually not a very powerful office. Yeah, I love that one. The presidency is not really a powerful office.
It's not a powerful thing. It's not a powerful thing. But if we don't vote for Joe Biden, we have basically allowed Hitler to get into office and dyed his hair into a Dennis Rodman color.
I know. That's the thing. The presidency is a really powerful office. It's just Obama didn't want to use the powers. But here comes Donald Trump. He'll show you how powerful it is. This guy is like stretching the power, figuring out ways to get things done that nobody's ever done before, like forcing foreign countries to enact his agenda because he can't do it through himself. This guy is like, but the Republicans always do this. They push the boundaries. They push the envelope. But no, Obama would not do it. Anyhow. I would talk about this forever if you don't stop me.
But doesn't that mean? And I mean, I'll just conclude with what with what you're saying is that I think this goes back to what Dr. Jill Stein was saying, which is you can't have revolution in a counter-revolutionary party, and that the Democrats, at the best of time, they're basically compassionate conservatives. I mean, whereas the Republicans don't believe, whereas the Republicans are basically, these Dickensian people, the Democrats are basically, what was once known in Britain as one nation conservatives, and many of those people later joined the Liberal Party, which is we don't want to see poor people dying left, right, center. Shouldn't us, the rich people, pay a little bit more in taxes so that they,
they're called Tory wets, the Tory wets, right? Thatcher hated those people. So,
yeah, I mean,
I think there's some validity to that.
I think in the end of the day, Obama was basically, the black, Justin Trudeau before there was a Justin Trudeau, and Justin Trudeau is basically the white Obama. These are rival oligarchs, and they're rival imperialists, and this may sound bizarre, but also rival racists, because Obama continued on with mass incarceration. He didn't do anything to stop the new Jim Crow. When Native Americans were begging, we don't want, this pipeline at Standing Rock, especially when we already have unsafe drinking water. Obama didn't do anything until the very last minute, and then lo and behold, Clinton loses the election, and Trump is like, okay, I'm signing up on the Standing Rock. And I think what Obama did to Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks, I think that really revealed his true nature and what kind of a man he was, what kind of a politician he was, and that's why I'm of the opinion that's why I'm of the opinion, and you're definitely familiar with people of this point of view in the U.S. The Ralph Naders of the world that say that there is no reforming the Democratic Party, or there is no infiltrating the Democratic Party, making it into an actual center-left party.
Okay, so I disagree with that, but let me start by, I do agree with something you were saying, that the Democratic Party, the sort of, I wouldn't say it's their fundamental nature, but it is who they are today. I was recently looking at the website of a member of Congress that the sort of progressive wing of the Democratic Party, really, they love this woman and they think she's great. And And I was reading her rhetoric. This is not one of the squad or anything like that, but it's another, woman who was elected recently. And I was reading her website, and it sounds really, it sounds really great. All this very progressive rhetoric, and then you read the things that she's in favor of, and the ways she means to go. Like she says, inequality is really bad. Inequality is out of control in this country. And then you go to, her solution for that, and it's a targeted tax cut for like parents of kids who want to send their I forget what it is, but it's like an educational it's like some minuscule something so incredibly tiny that it will literally do nothing to solve the problem, and nobody would ever even think it would solve the problem.
Which is why people loved Bernie Sanders, because Bernie Sanders, just like Dennis Kucinich before him, except a little bit sort of simplifying anyways, when Hillary Clinton was saying, I have a 5-point plan on how we can get more poor kids into college, Bernie would just go, I believe in public free tuition colleges. When Hillary Clinton would talk about, I'm going to make sure insurance companies do this, Bernie was like, I'm for single payer healthcare. Healthcare is a right, and everybody was like, yes.
Yeah, but that was you're exactly right. I once went to a Hillary campaign event, and and I'll never forget it. It was all about I wrote it up in Listen Liberal. It's the last chapter of Listen Liberal, and they were all talking about how they were going to raise up people of the third world, really poor people in the really poor people in the poorest countries in the world, and it was like, we're going to get them all bank accounts. It was the weirdest goddamn solution. And we're going to get them on Facebook. What? So you're going to not only
you went after and actually in your book, I remember because I recently read a book, a Canadian book about how corrupt NGOs are, called Paved with Good Intentions.
Yes.
And I think you went after the guy in Bangladesh who does
micro lending. Yeah, well, he's a big intimate of the Clinton family. I don't think I knew that until after I wrote the book, that he's been hanging around with them for years. Like if you go to the Clinton Library in Arkansas, there was some exhibit that mentioned him.
Muhammad Yunus, I think that's his name.
That's the guy. Yep. But look, it was an idea that was much heralded at the time. There were all of these people coming up with these solutions that were both pro poor people and pro Wall Street at the same time, and it's like, whoa, how do you do that? But there was this where there's a look, Youri, where there's a demand for bullshit ideas like that, people are going to come up with the bullshit ideas. They're going to come up with them when there's enough of a demand. And what's funny is the Clintons were still, that was 2015. The Clintons were still selling that shit. They were, they were still peddling that, and get everybody on Facebook too while you're at it. It was at this thing. Facebook and Twitter were still absolutely unambiguous agents of liberation. That's how they were. That's how they were described. It's like, who would say that today?
Well, yeah, exactly.
Maybe the same people would.
It's crazy. I mean, your book was "What's the Matter with Kansas?" I say to myself, "What's the matter with the left? What's the matter with the left that knows that the Clintons are bad, that knows that Obama is not a flaming left-winger like a Dennis Kucinich, but do all of those outlets?" And I'm not even talking about the New York Times, the New York Daily News, or the Los Angeles Times. I'm talking about the ones who are democratic reformers, like The Nation magazine, Mother Jones. These are outlets that all propped up Clinton and Obama, told us to ignore Dennis Kucinich and Mike Gravel.
Yeah, well, look. Hey, Youri, the only way you do real critical journalism in this country is to put yourself outside of political parties and not think of yourself as a cheerleader, and that's what I've tried to do. But I'm here to tell you, there's very little tolerance anymore for that kind of for people who take that kind of stance and who refuse to be a cheerleader for the parties. Now, that said, you said earlier that you don't think the Democrats can be reformed, and I actually think they can, and I think Bernie is. I mean, I know Ralph Nader. I really like Ralph Nader. He's a great man, and he's one of Bernie's best friends. But Bernie showed that working through the Democratic Party, that Ralph Nader message can be driven so much farther, can reach so many more people. Now, Bernie did not triumph, and you're right, they came together against him in the most spectacular way, and really unforgiving, because there's other Democrats like Elizabeth Warren, who the party really loves, who's saying a lot of very similar things to Bernie Sanders, but they have this vendetta against him personally, which was really remarkable.
And WikiLeaks exposed all of that just before the DNC. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm talking about this year, in 2020. Their determination to stop him was extraordinary. But that said, one of the things that was really remarkable about Donald Trump's run, I never saw this coming. I always thought of the Republican Party as being the more sort of authoritarian of the two organizations. There's these insiders in the Republican Party, and what they say goes, and the rest of the party gets in line. That's how I always understood the Republican Party. And Trump just shattered it into a million pieces. That was amazing what he did, crushing the Bush dynasty. And the Bushes, they don't forgive him. I bet they come out for Biden at some point, if they haven't already. I don't really follow this anymore.
Yeah.
Have they? I don't know. Maybe they have. But if Trump did that to the Republicans, surely that can be done to the Democrats, who are a much more disorganized, or much more disorganized than the Republicans ever were, or that have traditionally been. But everything seems to be changing now, and it's the Democrats are the ones who are coming together around, who are acting like the Republicans of old. By the way, in many, many different ways. It's not just this one. You mentioned earlier them adopting Republican foreign policy positions. That's remarkable, and they're also winning over Republican suburbs. So I grew up in a very Republican area, suburb of Kansas City. It is slowly but surely going blue. Biden signs all over the place. There's somebody just shut the door. I'm too loud. We're all.
I also have the same problem in my house.
Yeah, I got to ask you how COVID is in Belgium, because it really sucks here, and I've had enough of it.
I would say I'll briefly say that it's definitely not as bad as the UK and the US. But if you read the World Socialist websites, they do a fantastic job of smashing the myth that the Nordic countries are left utopias, Holland is a flaming left-wing place, and that France is a very left-wing place. So the World Socialist website, they do a very good job of covering, union corruption, so forth. And no, I think, globally, we're all really in the same mess. We all have these, ridiculous, rival oligarchic parties and pseudo-left parties, and even pseudo-left, opposition, like Greens and whatnot, who are all supporting in one shape, form, or another back to work, back to school thing, even though we have this ridiculous pandemic. Europe still has a little bit of a welfare state in which if you do lose your job, they're not going to, immediately throw you out on the streets, whereas it's a death sentence if you lose your job in, say, Canada, Australia, or yours truly, the US, especially in the US, which has the most, neo-Dickensian system. But here it's not so much better. I can even tell you, off camera one of these days, some of the horrible, austerity measures that were put in place in Belgium, which would make your skin crawl.
Yeah, I know all about that.
The European Union itself is a boring, centrist, quasi neoliberal.
Oh yes, absolutely, and you're going to follow us. So America is, by my thinking, America is always 10, 15, 20 years ahead of Europe. In some ways, I mean, you guys got Thatcher before we got. Well, it depends on how you figure it. Thatcher was slightly before Reagan, but only slightly. But we'd already had Nixon by that point, and we were already well on our way to the right. But we had a welfare state in America, by the end of the 1930s, so well before the European countries had. But I imagine that, the European Union is really locking things up, and And your parties of the left are also doing what the Democrats are doing, which is they're becoming parties of the professional managerial
Yeah,
class.
exactly. That's why the Socialist Party of France, is basically, is literally extinct now in France. I mean, even though Benoit Hamon was very much, an old school socialist reformer, his party, was just so disastrous when they were in power. I mean, first they started to tax the rich too high, as opposed to some of the other stuff that they need to do when you do a thing like that. But then on foreign policy, they were ultra reactionary. And of course they installed austerity, so now they're no longer in existence. The establishment went behind Macron.
Yeah.
And like how you said Donald Trump ran to Clinton's left on trade and certain foreign policies, Marine Le Pen ran to Macron's left on worker rights and stuff like that, and also on foreign policy.
Yep, it's the ugly truth. And but anyhow, we haven't even mentioned populism yet. Now that you mentioned Marine
exactly, and all right, and that's a perfect segue. So my first official question then.
Half hour in.
My first official question is this: is that explain the populist movement and the populist party. Explain how it was a left-wing farmers movement that believed in change from the bottom up, whereas progressives like Teddy Roosevelt believed in progressivism, which was change from the top down. And then after that, explain how the establishment, the progressives, basically, made populism into Eurozonophobic, reactionary,
very good question. Excellent question. So first, the thing we should probably start with, seeing as how you're in Belgium, is that in Europe the word populism is massively abused. I mean, it is a term. Exactly. It is a term of abuse, and there's a whole literature. I mean, they have conferences, academic conferences, and convenings, and Davos-like things all the time in Europe, where people get together and talk about how awful populism is and what are we going to do to stop it. And they never inquire about the origins of the word. I've been reading all of their literature on this. They will occasionally mention the U.S. Populist Party, but it never occurs to them that there's this whole very interesting history of the word, and that they themselves have been, in some ways, because these are the best and the brightest, these are highly educated people, often sponsored by big universities, that they themselves have fallen for a enormous historical mistake, that maybe their entire pedagogy is based on a mistake. They don't know this. So that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. I mean, one of several. But the Populist Party in America was not a Marine Le Pen, a kind of xenophobic nationalist group. It was not that. Yeah. It was a movement of farmers that came out of the Midwest and the South, and it was a mass movement. It was one of the great mass movements of American history. Millions and millions of members, and they were determined to figure out how to improve the farmers' situation through various means. They wound up going into politics and forming a third party, the last important third party in U.S. history. And
this was during the Gilded Age. So
yeah, 1890s.
So Britain, because I use the term Dickensian and neo-Dickensian, Britain had the Victorian period, which was one of the worst periods of mass inequality, and Charles Dickens.
Absolutely.
But the U.S. that period of time was called the Gilded Age, and Mark Twain was the guy.
Yeah, Mark Twain wrote about that. Yep. By the way, Kipling wrote about populism. He hated them. But we'll come to that later, or maybe we won't. I don't know. But anyhow, he lived in America for a while. But so America had rampant inequality, just like today. The monopolies were growing. Monopolies were out of control. Railroad monopolies in particular. A railroad is a de facto natural monopoly for the people for the farmers especially, who have to deal with it. the political corruption, Mark Twain wrote about this a lot, but political corruption was completely out of control. It was possible at the time since U.S. senators were chosen by state legislators, it was actually a fairly easy thing if you were rich enough to bribe an entire state legislator and get, whoever you wanted appointed to the U.S. Senate. And this was commonplace. The Vanderbilt family, who owned the New York Central Railroad, had their family attorney appointed to he was the U.S. senator from the state of New York.
And of course, you had Standard Oil.
Yeah,
Rockefellers.
Right, and they were powerful in more than one state. And in Kansas, there was a railroad that basically ran everything. It's called the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. Anyhow, long story. And the populists rose up in this climate and were specifically against all of these things: the incredible inequality, the power of monopolies, the political corruption. And they demanded certain reforms that would have helped out farmers. They wanted to get the U.S. off the gold standard, which was at the time the universal pillar of the global economy. They wanted to have various federal programs for farmers. They wanted the government to nationalize the railroads, which, was incredibly radical for the time. They wanted, still is. They wanted votes for women. They wanted a lot of electoral reforms they wanted to make lobbying illegal, for example. A lot of really interesting things like that. And they were so they came up at about the same time as the Labour Party in England, the Labour Party in Australia, Social Democrats in Austria, and they were similar to these other parties, only they were more they were based in agriculture. Although they tried to reach out to unions, they had some unions on board, the Knights of Labor, and the United the mine workers. People like this were on board with populism. And for a while, this third party was very successful, and it was growing and growing and growing and expanding and challenging the other two parties here and there. And then everything seemed to be going their way. The economy went into a depression, huge unemployment, gigantic strikes, and there was a protest march on Washington, the first one ever, organized by populists. And it looked like it was their moment. And then all of a sudden, everything went wrong. Shall I go into details? You want to hear the story? It's actually really fun.
Yeah, exactly.
We're going to kill all our time here.
So basically, they were gaining ground. The movement was gaining ground, but then there was an orchestrated establishment backlash.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens in America with third parties is nobody tries the third party thing anymore. People try, but they don't succeed. The populists had governors, senators, members of Congress, mayors, all over the place. The last time this has been successfully tried in America. And what happens when
your home state of Kansas,
right? But it was they were all over. So Kansas had more than one populist governor and a bunch of senators and members of Congress. But you had it in all the Western states. Populism was strong. California had populists, and in the South you had populists. The only place where you didn't have them was in the Northeast. So in New York, Pennsylvania, places like that.
And is that where the Progressive Party and the progressive movements had more?
Yeah, later on. Yeah, they come about 20 years later, and they take a lot of the populist ideas and actually get them enacted. So a lot of the reforms that the populists wanted to do, the progressives were able to do it. But the progressives, as you noticed, as you pointed out at the beginning, they come from a very different class background. The populists this is the lowest rank of humanity. These are, in the South especially, these are sharecroppers, okay, who were still at the time allowed to vote. And they were demanding, these are people from the very bottom demanding reforms, educating themselves and coming together and demanding reforms. And the establishment reacted against them in exactly that way, saying, how dare they do this? This is an uprising of the ignorant, and an uprising of people who need to learn their place. People who don't understand anything. They're in the grip of mental illness. There was a lot of writing about this at the time, speculating that populism was a form of mental disease. It was a kind of mass hypnosis. You're in Belgium, you read French. There was a theorist called Gustave Le Bon wrote a book called this guy called The Crowd.
Well, I can understand more French than I can speak, but yeah, I went to English. But yeah, I went to English speaking schools, and I would learn about all of these guys, and yeah, and they're basically and even Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt hated populism.
Well,
he thought their leaders should be rounded up and shot.
Well, he was also a eugenicist. He actually, did believe that that if you were poor, you were born poor because
for a reason. There's a reason.
Social Darwinism and all that jazz.
Yeah. That's right, and that was a powerful strain in the people who hated populism. So that is this weird strain in right-wing thinking that is today completely gone. But you can't understand right-wing thinking, and I would argue you can't even understand today professional class thinking without understanding that background. But Gustave Le Bon was a French theorist who hated democracy. He was the first theorist of mass psychology, crowd psychology, and the people who hated populism were reading this guy and they're like, this explains his book, which came out in 1896 in English, that is, explains populism. That's what it is. It's mass hypnosis by people like William Jennings Bryan, these great orators of the time. And that's how they understood populism. Anyhow, so what happened in this case was the Democratic Party was at the time was no different than the Republican Party. It was different because it was largely Southern, largely immigrants, largely Catholics, whereas the Republicans were Northerners, was Protestants, was native-born Americans, but on the issues they were almost exactly the same.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden in 1896, the Democratic Party takes this crazy swerve to the left and embraces some of populism's issues under under their new leader, William Jennings Bryan, this is the first time that the Democratic Party, this is the moment when it becomes a party that is noticeably to the left of the Republicans. And he's a very inspiring figure, gives this great speech. The populists see this. He gets nominated for the presidency by the Democrats. The populists see this happening and they say, well, he's not with us on everything, but he's pretty good. And he speaks our language. And a lot of them knew him personally. A lot of the leaders knew him personally. And so they were like, okay, we're going to get on board with this guy. We're going to endorse the Democrat. And if he wins, and everybody thought he was going to win at the time, if he wins, then we will we'll have power, we'll have clout in Washington. And the Republicans mobilized the most extraordinary campaign of hate and hysteria against William Jennings Bryan and absolutely crush this guy. And it's one of the really amazing chapters.
Would you say it's comparable to what happened to Jeremy Corbyn last year?
Well, I wasn't there, so I don't know. I had not thought of that. I haven't made that comparison.
Well, because the media campaign against Jeremy Corbyn was the most naked orchestrated campaign to destroy a left-wing populist leader and his, and his movement. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn and his team also dug their own graves by throwing a lot of their supporters under the bus, but that's a whole.
Yeah. But that's always the problem with the left, isn't it? But I had not thought of that example, but that's probably the case. I mean, you might be right. But the thing is that we see these hysterical outbreaks again and again in American history, outbreaks that are driven by fear of mob rule, fear of the people on the bottom. We're seeing another version of it right now. By the way, both parties are doing it. The Democrats are still, doubling down on like Trump supporters are these deplorables. We can't let them, they don't know anything. They don't understand science, and the Trump people are looking at Black Lives Matter and saying, oh my God, anarchy in the streets. Both sides have a version of this now. It's everybody is hysterical in America. And it's like, choose your hysteria. Which flavor do you want your hysteria in? But 1896 is this incredible outbreak of upper class hysteria directed at populism. And they used the word populism as shorthand for everything that was wrong with left-wing politics. It's anti-intellectual. They don't understand. There's a mental illness to it. It's the people on the bottom trying to rise above their station and tell the captains of industry how to run their business. And this is none of their business, and they just don't understand the modern global economy. And people said this in the 1890s, all of which is being replayed today.
And again, this even reminds me, even though Brexit was was a triumph, of xenophobic politics and and all sorts of stuff like that. But the fundamentalist Remainers, who the Brexiteers called Ramoners, that's exactly how they were talking about people who voted to leave the European Union. That they did not know what they voted for. That they were ignorant. That they were duped by Russians, and that they were duped by Facebook ads and Cambridge Analytica, and then when the Labour Party was saying, okay, let's have a second referendum, the Liberal Democrats were saying that, the Greens were saying that, the entire population basically gave them two middle fingers and voted for the Conservatives.
Well, I'll tell you my own feeling about that. I didn't live in England, and it's none of my business. But when the IMF came out and said, "Don't vote for Brexit," I probably would have voted for it when that happened.
Exactly.
And I also, you're in Belgium. I don't begrudge anybody the right to be extremely skeptical about the European Union, and the euro and all that. But yeah, we're getting off course.
Exactly.
This is American history is what I deal in. And you see these, I call it a democracy scare. What happened to William Jennings Bryan and to populism, a democracy scare. And they often use the word populism in these episodes to describe what they despise. And these recur. You see it happen to Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. By the way, and again, the eugenics comes up and is an important element in the anti-New Deal stuff of the time. And you see it again now in our own time. But there's the really interesting chapter, or what I think is the most interesting chapter, is when the word populism is revived in the 1950s, and its meaning is completely flipped by this generation of intellectuals coming out of the American universities in the 1950s. They called them.
But William Jennings Bryan, he was defeated. The propaganda war against.
Yeah, sorry, he lost. Yeah, it wasn't a big blowout. It was fairly close, but the Republicans outspent him 20 or 30 to 1. We don't really know. Bryan had virtually no campaign funds. The presidential campaign of the Democratic Party consisted of he himself going around the country and giving speeches from the backs of trains. And he didn't own the train or anything. He would just buy a ticket.
And the Republican he was running against was who?
William McKinley. Sorry, I skipped over that. Yeah, William McKinley. And Teddy Roosevelt was at the time, I think he was police commissioner of New York or something. But Roosevelt was an up and coming Republican, and was one of the people that the Republican Party sent around the country. They sent a squad of lecturers around the country. Everywhere that Bryan went, these guys would show up the next day, and like a whole team of them, and then they would do some anti-Bryan, stunt. And Roosevelt was one. He did that, and he absolutely hated populism and despised the populists, which is interesting because later he becomes McKinley's vice president. McKinley then gets shot and dies, and Roosevelt becomes president. He's very young, and once he's in office, lo and behold, embraces a lot of the things that the populists and people like William Jennings Bryan had been advocating, but doing it again, as you mentioned, on behalf of an elite. This very elite. Teddy Roosevelt was really from the American aristocracy, such as it was, and. It did it from a very elite perspective, so in some ways similar to populism, in some ways completely the opposite. I don't know if he ever got over his hatred for Bryan, or Bryan, stopped being angry at him, but.
And of course, Teddy Roosevelt.
By the way, Bryan is a very interesting. I don't write about this in the book, but Bryan's the later history of his life is very both inspiring and tragic. In the year 1900, he ran again as the Democratic candidate. And his issue this time, so in 1896, his big issue was the gold standard, get America off the gold standard. And in 1900, his issue was imperialism, because by that time we'd had the war with Spain and the U.S. had conquered the Philippines. And President McKinley by this time had said, we're going to become an imperial power. The U.S. is going to join the European nations and be an imperial power. And Bryan said no. Bryan said, no, that's not who we are. We are a democracy. Democracies don't do this. And he made that his great issue. And if you go back and read his speeches from 1900, they're very inspiring. The man was a pacifist and also was against imperialism. And he was taunted by the very same people who hated him, the same magazines and columnists and etc., taunted in 1900 basically as a race traitor, because he was siding with the Filipinos against our soldiers, and they would characterize him in this way, in these really sort of vile racist cartoons in 1900. And then he ran again a couple of years later. It was totally fruitless by that point, but the Democrats needed a nominee, and he was a loyal Democrat, so he ran, and he lost. But when Woodrow Wilson eventually became president and named Bryan his Secretary of State, and Bryan was actually really good at this job, being Secretary of State. But unfortunately, again, he was a pacifist. And when the U.S. started saying, we're going to get in World War I, we need a piece of this action, Bryan actually quit. He actually refused to do it. He would not participate in that. So in my mind, he's kind of a heroic guy. And his life ends in a really sad way. He was a real Bible-believing Christian, among other things, and became a kind of fundamentalist leader in the 1920s, and wound up involved in this stupid trial where the state of Tennessee was prosecuting a teacher for teaching the theory of evolution, and they brought in William Jennings Bryan as a kind of a guest prosecutor or something. And I've always thought that, and then he died shortly afterwards. And he's been basically a figure of fun and of derision in American culture ever since. This poor, sad guy that stood up for, that was against the theory of evolution. But if you think about it, what he was actually against was what was called social Darwinism, which was a reprehensible doctrine and had been unleashed against him. You just mentioned it, had been used against him many times.
The eugenics movement.
Yes. And he was against that. And that is a noble thing to do. And I've always felt really sorry for this guy, because this is a guy that really fought for the right thing. He maybe came at it from a background, this fundamentalist Christianity that we don't think very highly of anymore. But he was on the right side of most of the big issues of his day. Except for prohibition, he was on the wrong side of that.
Yeah.
But anyhow,
but that's so fascinating. And again, because not only did I want you to explain, how populism is actually a positive thing that we should embrace, especially if you are a leftist, but progressivism. Because one of the people that that you admire and that past guest on this show, Peter Kuznick, admires is FDR's VP
Henry Wallace. You think of Henry Wallace?
Yeah, Henry Wallace. So explain then.
Wallace was another great. Iowa farmer. He came out of the. Although he didn't acknowledge it, not many people did in the 30s. He had a lot in common with the populist tradition. He certainly talked like a populist. If you look at the statements, he was vice president during World War II, and if you look at the things that he said and the way that he talked, when Time magazine did a special issue about, or had an editorial calling it the American Century. He fired back. He gave a famous speech. I'm looking for it right now. He said, "No, it's the century of the common man." He's kind kind of a great guy. Anyhow, he eventually ran for president himself as a third-party candidate, and in 1948, and it did not end well for him, which is, but that's not a story I go into in the book. But the story that we do need to talk about is, how we started this part of the conversation by talking about the European sort of intellectuals and their war on populism, what they call populism. And by the way, I think it is a good thing that they are analyzing and criticizing the far right, the racist right, and I wish them success in criticizing and defeating the racist right. But why do they have to call it populist? This doesn't make any sense to an American who knows what the populist movement is and knows that these are the guys who invented the word populist. And so you wonder, how did they get their definition of this word? And the answer is, it comes from this academic movement in the 1950s, led by an American historian named Richard Hofstadter, who decided to reinterpret the 1890s populist movement and reinterpreted it as authoritarian, racist, xenophobic, backward-looking, basically as a proto-fascist movement. And this
even though there was nothing at all to support that evidence.
You could come up with things. You could come up with things. So some of the populists were a little nutty. I mean, look, it was a movement of millions of people. A lot of them were self-educated. It's also the 1890s. So some of them were anti-Semites. There's no question about it. Some of them were, but by the standards of the day, anti-Semitism was quite rare in the populist movement. Now, Hofstadter puts it the other way around. He says they were the main. They introduced anti-Semitism to America, which is completely, profoundly wrong. He was, and other historians corrected him on this and said, and were able to demonstrate this is completely upside down. But for whatever reason, Hofstadter's take on populism was an enormous hit. He got the Pulitzer Prize. It was a massive bestseller. It's still read today. He is honored above all other American historians, whereas all the books refuting him, and they refuted him in a crushing way. All the books refuting him were highly academic, scholarly. They're not widely read. I've got a collection of them here. There's guys that refuted. Like this one, right? This is about the intellectuals in McCarthy, a book of sociology, and refuting just one little part of Hofstadter's take. Another one went through the populist leaders in Kansas, like the idea that populists were xenophobic or anti-immigrant. The author is like, well, look at this county in Kansas. Here's the populists were strong here, and whoa, look at that. Their leader was from, Belgium, or their leader was from Ireland, or was a recent immigrant from Scandinavia, or whatever it was. And refutes it in this crushing way, by doing this granular examination. And Hofstadter's way of establishing that was look at this novel that the populists liked, and in this novel, there's a lot of suspicion of foreigners. Therefore, the populists were. Oh, I'm sorry, that's bullshit. That's bad history, and they called him out on that. But he and his generation started using the word populist to describe proto-fascist authoritarian movements. And the theory was that all working class movements, all movements from the bottom up, are fundamentally proto-fascist. They're all authoritarian. Well, there's a famous book called The Authoritarian Personality. Theodor Adorno wrote this. There was all of these worries. This is right after World War II. Everybody is like, what allowed Nazism to happen? And they blame it on the working class, which is this really weird move. But all of these intellectuals did it. All of these American intellectuals did it. And the word they used to describe this complex of personality pathologies was populism. And as I said, they were massively refuted in trying to describe in trying to trace this to the original populist movement, but it caught on anyway. And I think the reason it caught on is because they were writing a manifesto for the professional middle class. This is the 1950s. This is the great age of managerialism. All these people are coming up and starting to run American society. These were guys like Daniel Bell. This is one of Hofstadter's colleagues or friends. The end of ideology. And in this book, he's talking about how great Robert McNamara is. The great. He's Robert McNamara is the defense secretary under Kennedy.
But long-term wise, were these people also? I assume these are probably people who were part of the backlash against the New Deal, and
no. These were liberals. These are liberals. They actually had an interpretation of the New Deal, which was also false, which I also refute in the book, but. Their interpretation of the New Deal is that was the dawning of people like them. That's when intellectuals started to run things. And if we look at the New Deal, we can see how great it is to put intellectuals in power. And what I point out is, that's not the case at all. There were obviously Roosevelt had what was called a brain trust, his House intellectuals, but these guys were by no means the leading intellectuals of the day. They were cranks. They were super, outside the mainstream. And whenever you talk about the New Deal, you have to. That's what made it succeed, was that he was not using orthodox economics. He was not bringing in, the people who taught at the Ivy League schools and stuff like that. And we've totally overlooked that. But these guys were liberals. That's the critical thing. So they were not right-wingers. Some of them later became, in the 80s, moved to the right and became conservatives. That whole movement, which happens later on. But these were, by and large, these were liberals. And this is the moment where liberalism starts to identify itself with the managerial philosophy. And I mentioned Robert McNamara, who was, Kennedy's defense secretary, and who these guys all thought was so brilliant. He was the great personification of the managerial ideal. He'd been chairman of the Ford Motor Company and all that sort of thing. And, what's his great triumph? The Vietnam War. And it's like this. What's funny is that the Democrats, and this eventually becomes openly after, in the 70s, becomes the Democratic Party's grand philosophy. They are going to give up on the working class because the working class is authoritarian and is, everybody can see is moving to the right. They basically blame the Vietnam War on the working class, because the unions were supporting Lyndon Johnson. They thought they were being loyal, and they blame the Vietnam War on working class people and say, we've got to embrace these really enlightened kids coming off the college campuses, kids like Bill Clinton, and stuff like that. And that's that's how the Democratic Party becomes what it is. It's I'm shortening dramatically here, but it's basically by misinterpreting history again and again, and these sort of white collar would-be professionals or soon-to-be professionals who are just absolutely in love with their own goodness. We talk about virtue signaling all the time. These are people who have been in love with their own virtue since the late 1960s and just can't give it up and just can't get over it. And we're going to ride that particular little vanity train right down into hell if we don't look out. I'm sorry, I'm mixing metaphors there, but you know what I mean.
But isn't it safe to say that the progressive movement, Teddy Roosevelt, who ended the Gilded Age and started the progressive era, who actually embraced the muckrakers and actually gave birth to the first FDA, brought all those antitrust laws to break up, monopolies. Yep. But is it safe to say that the progressives were basically liberals? I mean, liberals aren't against capitalism. It's just they have this ideology of noblesse oblige and in some ways, you could be a conservative and be a progressive, which was what Teddy Roosevelt was, and which was what the old center-right party in Canada used to be called the Progressive Conservatives, right?
Yeah. Absolutely, because you understand progress as a function of the market. And by the way, Hofstadter, the historian I was speaking of, explicitly said that. That's why were the populists, how could he say that the populists were against progress, which he would say that because progress is embodied in accepting the market. And populists didn't do that. Therefore, they were against progress, which is just, I'm sorry, that is fucking nuts. That's like that's the dumbest interpretation
Exactly.
ever. But that was his argument, and a lot of people believed it. But yeah, you're right about that. You're right about that. Hey, Youri, I have to cut this short. I'm about to starve. I got to eat lunch. I haven't eaten anything this morning.
Well, this is why I never understand guests or the people who are in charge of organizing interviews when they say can you do it in the morning, and I think to myself, well, aren't they going to get really hungry by afternoon? Isn't it better to do like an interview like in the evening or the afternoon? But any no, but Mr. Frank, okay, we're gonna do this. This conversation is to be continued. No, this conversation is this conversation is going to be continued. But before before we end it, I mean, first of all, people have to get this book. I'm definitely planning on getting this book. Because I really enjoyed What's the Matter with Kansas and Listen Liberal, which are two books which can easily explain to everybody why why
so
do we vote against why do we vote against our own interests? Yeah. Why do these ostensibly left parties do these stupid things they do? So
all right, well said, sir. I like that. That's very nice of you.
But in closing, what do you want what do you want the left to know when they read this book and they try to figure out how we can stop the vicious cycle that we're talking about, where you have the Donald Trumps of the world, the Nigel Farages of the world, the Marine Le Pens of the world, taking our left arguments, the sincerity,
but they're phonies. But they're phonies. Yeah, but they are doing that. You're right. But they're also phonies, and they never deliver anything. And what they do deliver is like, look at America now. It's a effing disaster. What do I want them to understand? I used to think, Youri, that if I reasoned with these people, that they would see the light and they would be like, okay, we've made a wrong turn, back in the Clinton days, and we need to put that in reverse. And now I understand that will never happen, that they will never come to that realization by themselves. Just so you know, there are good Democrats who totally agree with what I argue in these books. I talked to them. Some of them are in Congress. They're really good people, and they totally get this. But you can't make the party leadership change their mind. They did this on purpose. They knew this was going to be a disaster and a problem. They did it anyway. You take a guy like Barack Obama. He's very, very, very smart. He understood that what he was doing was not an optimal solution, and he did it anyway. So I don't think that persuasion is enough. We have to mobilize. Look, ultimately, the lesson of populism is that mass movements of working class people, they work. They succeed. They get things done, and that's what we've got to have.
But you were saying to me that because I'm of the opinion that we have to. Because I'm of the opinion that the people powered movements should support the Socialist Equality Party or Party for Socialism and Liberation.
Yeah, or in America, I think they should. They should
or the Green Party. But you're of the opinion that that history has shown, for whatever reason, it doesn't work. But you're still an advocate, though, of trying to take over the Democratic Party, right?
Yes, that's what I think. That's the strategy. But look, as the years have gone by, it used to be what I'm arguing for. I'd say, like, we need more liberals. We need to get more liberals out there. And now I'm saying we need a mass movement of working class people. Well, that's pretty goddamn hard to summon up. you know? And so as I've gotten older, it's like the task that I imagine has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. But look, once you get the mass movement going, the politicians will come around. You look at the 1930s, which is the great moment of success for these movements that I'm describing. And the politicians did come around. And look, the Republican Party almost went extinct in this country because of how they bungled the Great Depression, and because of organized labor, and because of Franklin Roosevelt. And that can happen again. That can happen again. And look, ultimately, I don't care which party they work through. I've had, left-wing friends of mine. I've been on the left for a long time, Youri, and my colleagues have gotten frustrated. A lot of them have given up, gone on to other things. But I remember some of my friends telling me, look, Trump has shown us that the Republican Party is fundamentally shattered. It would be easier at this point to take over the Republican Party than to take over the Democratic Party. Now, I don't have an opinion about that. I've never studied it, and I don't know. But wouldn't that be?
Maybe that's what we should do. Maybe that's what we should do. Maybe that's what we should do. We should just all become Republicans. We just lie about how we're a bunch of Christian fascists and a bunch of corporatists. And then before you know it, we have, President Tulsi Gabbard and Vice President Bernie Sanders.
Wouldn't that be hilarious? Anyhow,
Ralph Nader can be in charge of the Federal Reserve. Who knows?
Yeah. But anyhow, that's
all right. Well, on that note,
that's a story for another occasion.
That's a story for another occasion. So, ladies and gentlemen, we were joined by Thomas Frank. Please get his book, What's the Matter with Kansas? Listen Liberal, One Market Under God. But if you're very interested, get his new book, The People Say No. Mr. Frank, thank you very much for joining us. I look forward to hopefully having you back on as a regular because we really only touched the tip of the iceberg. So.
Yes, we did. All right. Hey, anytime. You got it, Youri.
Thank you very much.
All right. See you later.